and I'm singing just for you, covered in sequins.
Hello, my lovers. Today we're taking a look at Unknown Armies, the newer edition. A very kind sponsor got me the books. Thanks, I hate it. Spoiler alert. So why, if we're talking about Unknown Armies, do I have Over the Edge here? Well, both Unknown Armies and Over the Edge were Atlas Games products. Both of them seem to have taken a similar design tangent in their new material, and that's why I don't like either of them very much. See, Over the Edge was already very rules light. Okay, you would pick a few keywords, they would have a number of dice assigned to them, and that would be pretty much it as far as character creation was concerned. Was there room for some simplification? Certainly. The combat and damage rules were a bit clunky and kind of bolted on last minute, it felt like. But in the newer edition of Over the Edge, yeah, it's a role-playing game where there's barely any game. Everything was stripped right back to the point that there is very little to actually engage with in terms of system. So too far. They went too far simplifying Over the Edge and made it pretty much unplayable in any meaningful sense in the state that it now exists. And, you know, despite having basically nothing in terms of rules, it's still clocked in at 270 plus pages. Disappointing, very disappointing. There are not words in human language to express how disappointed and upset I was upon receiving the new Over the Edge. Lasai. So that brings us to Unknown Armies, also originally Atlas Games, and similarly simplified, even dumbed down, less generous people might say, far more than it needed to be. In fact, if Over the Edge had used the new system for Unknown Armies, I would have been perfectly happy with Over the Edge. But it didn't, and I'm not. And in terms of Unknown Armies, the simplifications that they've done here have taken it far too far for Unknown Armies, in my opinion. So the common link is that both Atlas Games games and the newer editions have been drastically oversimplified from where I would have liked them or where I need them to be as a games master. And a lot of this comes down to characters. Now, sure, as we discussed in my review of the older edition of Unknown Armies, your characters were generally pretty incompetent. And that was, by turns, funny and frustrating in a lot of ways. They've done away with most of the skills in the new Unknown Armies, so things are tightened up. Skills have a far broader sort of scope to them. They're still not much better, but you can be better at more multiple things by investing in a single skill than otherwise. So the skill list here is massively truncated, but that presents problems, and it's a problem that I don't think either story gamers, indie gamers, or OSR fans really seem to appreciate. The less complexity, the less options you have within a game, the harder it is to customize your character in any meaningful way, to have the character grow in any meaningful way. So by getting rid of options, crunch, complexity, and so on, you are actually getting rid of many of the ways in which you can characterize your character, you can develop your character, you can represent their past, and so on, when you've only got very few options, you're taking those options away from people. One of the really great things about a comparable game like Call of Cthulhu, which is, you know, investigative horror and supernatural in much the same way that Unknown Armies kind of is. One of the great things about that is that your character develops according to their experience in the game, right? So while you might start out playing a bookish librarian, if you get into a lot of fist fights in a Call of Cthulhu game or a BRP game more broadly, then you're going to get better at that. You are going to increase in skill as you go along. You're going to become more competent in the things that you're exposed to. That's how it's going to work. And then you have lots of skills in Call of Cthulhu or similar, and you used to have quite a lot of skills in Over the Edge, and so you can differentiate one character from another much more easily. You can reflect their background much more easily. You can develop them in interesting ways. And so when you get rid of all those options, you lose all that characterization, and you lose all that story, and you lose all that narrative. So ironically, this sort of cult of simplicity that I think afflicts a lot of OSR games as well, but mostly story games, ends up creating less story, less differentiation between characters, less characterization. It leaves them nowhere to go, especially in a lot of the newer story games where you start out hyper competent. So yeah, that's a shame. So here you get very few skills, and now they've been intimately tied to the kind of sanity hardening mechanic. So you have meters for helplessness, isolation, self, unnatural, and violence, and depending how weakened or how strong you get according to those different things, if you become hardened to violence or if you become freaked out by violence, this has an impact on how high your skills can be. So 10 out of 10 for theme, I suppose. Madness and separation from humanity being strong themes in this game, but minus several million points for common sense, because having it tied to your mental health makes a lot of sense than having it tied to your physical characteristics and so on, which you don't have in this game. So it misses a lot of opportunities for narrative, character development, and characterization for the sake of theme, but in a way that doesn't necessarily make a great deal of sense or work particularly well. Violence, for example, is tied to connect, how well you relate to other people, and to struggle fighting. So the more hardened you get to fighting, the better you get at it. The more freaked out by violence and so on, the more distanced you become from people. It makes a vague kind of sense and it fits the theme, but the mental meters mechanic, I liked it, but a lot of people didn't like that about the older version of Unknown Armies. They felt it was an overcomplicated way of keeping track of a character's mentality and mental health and how tough they were. They felt it was a bit clumsy and overcomplicated. If anywhere was ripe for a bit of simplifying, it was probably that, but instead they've essentially excised the entire rest of the system and then added back a few points. Now, your capabilities are also supplemented by what are called identities. These are keywords, which is a bit more like Over the Edge. So if you want to be a magician, an adept, or to embody a certain concept as an avatar, that will be one of your keywords, and you can have another one. It might be something like ex-soldier, something like that. So those identities have ratings and they can be substituted in for one of the other skills. So if you have a good identity as an ex-soldier and you get into a fight, but because of your mental health, your violence capability isn't particularly great, then you can substitute in your former soldier identity, for example. The dice system itself remains largely the same. It's roll D100, get underneath a modified skill roll. Maybe you can flip-flop the 10s and units if that skill is a particular obsession, or if you've got artifacts or other things giving you advantages. So that's largely the same. It's just you've got such a severely truncated set of skills and identities that you're going to be by default slightly more competent, but your competency is still limited. I think the highest a skill can go normally is now about 60, something like that. Once you start going slightly crazy, you're becoming slightly hardened. So it still has its incompetence limiters, but less so when it comes to your identities. The game itself is far more focused on the global and cosmic scale of the old game, whereas the street level of the old game was always, I thought, the much more engaging sort of level to play the game at. That was the default, that was the version of the game that came out of the page as the focus for the older game. But focusing on this higher, larger, sort of 1,000-foot view of the conflicts in the magical underworld here very much moves the game more into the shadow of Mage the Ascension, the storyteller game. And while we haven't had a new edition of Mage yet, Unknown Armies was always kind of in the shadow of Mage, except for the street level, where it did genuinely feel different. But once you start talking about the global and cosmic scale, the threats are largely similar. There's the obsession with consensus in both games, for example, and the threat to reality that the high-level avatars, the exemplars of human concepts represent in this. Yeah, it's not dissimilar to the way in which the main focus and theme of Mage is this battle for consensus reality, whether it's going to be a scientific and technocratic future or one of pixies and dragons or whatever else the various different factions might be fighting for, which is often just survival, to be honest. So by focusing on that higher level, I think Unknown Armies fails to differentiate itself properly from a rival game such as Mage, which covers a lot of the same ground and has a much more competent system and engaging way of playing at that higher level, because magic in this is hard. Right? It's difficult. You're still almost always better off punching someone than trying to hit them with a magical attack spell of some kind. Book 2 is called Run. It's how to run the game. It's a book of Games Master advice. Now, in my opinion, the GM book is far too general in its advice. Let's face it, Unknown Armies is not going to be the vast and overwhelming majority of people's first experience with role-playing games, either playing or running. Right? This is a game you pick up after you've been initiated into the secret order of gamers. It isn't where you're going to start, and yet, despite that, this is largely full of what you could term generic advice to role players. Right, there's some stuff that's a bit more related to Unknown Armies, but unfortunately a lot of that stuff that is more related to Unknown Armies is prescriptive, which is a common issue with a lot of story games and modern games as a whole. You must play this way, outside of the rules, telling you must organize the game upon a certain structure. So something you see in a lot of Japanese games, but that's a cultural difference, I think. This idea that there is a right way to play and that certain people shouldn't play certain games and so on, that seems to be a new idea, and nope, I don't like it. So we have generic advice, which is no good for anyone, and prescriptive advice, which I think chafes any more experienced games master, and most people who play Unknown Armies are going to be more experienced games masters. I think you're going to chafe against it. It's also almost all bump. It's fluff. There's almost no crunch in here, which makes it in a lot of ways rather singularly unhelpful to you as a games master. If you want to save time, right, you need generic NPCs, things like that. A lot of games seem to be leaving that stuff out, and that's worth far more to me as a games master prepping for a game than any amount of telling me how to play or generic advice is going to be. Right? So this was disappointing, generally not especially helpful. Book 3, on the other hand, this is a diamond in the rough. This is the corn kernel in the turd. This is an encyclopedia of the setting, basically. So if you need to look anything up that's to do with the game or the setting, you can use this as a reference book. This is a brilliant idea. When I stumbled on, without thinking about it, when I did the Gorean encyclopedia for Tales of Gore, which is a useful reference for people who even aren't gamers, who are into that world, and that's proven very useful. But so this gives you easy access without hiding all the information in purple prose or unreliable narrators. You can look stuff up here. Now, again, it is kind of lacking in crunch. There's some crunch here and there that you can reference. That's great. That's fantastic where it exists. But again, not enough. But at least you can be disappointed and frustrated with the lack of information with greater alacrity than you would otherwise be able to do, delving through the main book, trying to find that particular reference or whatever that you were looking for. So this is great. This is good. This is an idea I would like to see more of. A sort of monster manual of concepts, if you will. So, what do we think of the newer Unknown Armies overall? In terms of style, I don't think the system any longer particularly works with the style of game that we're looking at, and limits the amount of characterization and story that you can produce or reflect within your character by its oversimplification. And I think this cult of oversimplification needs to die in a fire, to be honest. So, there's nothing wrong with simple systems and so on per se, as long as they're simple and elegant, but simplicity for simplicity's sake doesn't necessarily make for a better game, even a better story, narrative-driven game. So that's a problem. Also, the art for this was a lot of it's photographs, which I don't like in game books. I would much rather see illustration. I don't like it in the newer Vampire. I never used to like it in like the Buffy and Angel RPG tie-ins with the series, where they would just litter it with screen captures. It never looks as good as you think it's going to. Unfortunately, illustration always works better. A lot of the stuff in here is photo montage, but kind of ironically, given this was produced before the AI revolution started to take place, a lot of this looks like it could have been made by AI. You know, you could have illustrated this book possibly even better in a lot of ways by just going to an AI and typing in photo montage modern occult in the style of Dave McKean, and you would probably get better results. And the weird hands and the other artifacts and issues that you have with AI would not look out of place in Unknown Armies. There could have even been a meta commentary on, you know, eroding humanity and so on. But this took place beforehand, but it doesn't look good. And the old Unknown Armies didn't look particularly good either. Very plain, very black and white, but grey due to the print quality. And the artwork wasn't fantastic, but it had a bit more character to it at least, and you know, it was produced in a different time, in a different context, and so on. But I really don't like it. layout wise, it's fine, right? It's got plenty of stuff. Its version of a trigger warning is almost a protest against trigger warnings in a way. It's trying to play both sides, but that's a move towards compromise, which we can celebrate. But the layout itself is fairly simple, fairly readable, black on white. We're on heavy, glossier paper now, of course, so it'll stand up to referencing a bit more, but might smudge. But yeah, the real thing for me is the jarring between the system and the setting, and the presumable goals of the system and the setting, and the overemphasis on the global and cosmic scale, when I think Unknown Armies is best played at the street level. In terms of substance, there's a lot of fluff, not enough crunch, not enough nuts and bolts that you as a games master will need. So prep work, even though the system is now simpler, is going to be a lot more, and feels like it's missing a lot of stuff that you would need to reference. So in terms of style then, in the modern context, all things considered, I can't really give it more than a high 2, a 3 for style, and similar for substance. So we're talking 5 or 6 out of 10, 3 out of 5, so average, meh. And I shouldn't be saying meh about Unknown Armies. It is not a game that should be meh, but it is. Zang.
Do you like t-shirts?
Yeah, boy!
Do you like games?
Certainly.
Are you perhaps a little bit kinky?
Yes, quite.
Then buy one of our B&D t-shirts at Teespring. Teespring.com/stores/postmortem-studios. You want to be cool, don't you?
Does the word duh mean anything to you?